Good afternoon. On our panel, we have, as usual, 4 opera experts today. They are, in alphabetical order, Walter Ducloux, conductor of the Symphony Orchestra and head of the opera department at the University of Southern California; Sigmund Leverie, professor of music history at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York, as well as an author; Tony Randall, a leading television and screen actor and music lover who never seems to miss a chance to go to the opera or to a concert whenever his heavy acting schedule permits; and George Schick, a Metropolitan Opera conductor and the music consultant for the company. Mr. Schick is also the musical director of the Metropolitan Opera Studio. So welcome to the quiz, gentlemen. And here's our first question, a rather timely one, I think, from Herman Berger of Rockaway Beach, New York. Mr. Berger writes us this: Victor Hugo, who wrote the play on which Verdi's Rigoletto was based, said, or is reputed to have said, that he could hardly recognize his own characters when he heard them in the opera. Mr. Berger's question to you is, do you think that William Shakespeare would have been pleased with Verdi's Otello, the opera based on his play? Mr. Randall?
Well, he loved music. He wrote a great deal about it, and if music be the food of love, etc., etc. I wonder if he'd have recognized his characters, though, or if it would have mattered very much to him. The characters come from a novel called, I think it's called Othello, but I'm not sure, by a man named Cintio. And the characters are so different. Shakespeare changed them so much that he couldn't really object if someone else changed them after him.
Who do you feel has been changed most, since you feel the characters are so changed?
Iago's been changed quite a bit, very simplified. In any case, the whole first act is dropped, and many people think that's good. The only thing that's beautiful that's lost is the speech to the Senate, but that's incorporated into the love duet at the end of the first act. I think he would have loved it.
Dr. Ducloux?
By the way, the story is based on a real incident involving one Lodovico Moro, whose name was Moro, who was not a Moor at all, and Shakespeare changed him into a Moor, because yes, Moro means Moor in Italian. Yes. But I also think that Shakespeare would have loved it, but he would have kissed on both cheeks Mr. Arrigo Boito, who made the libretto. And he would have thought, this man did what I myself couldn't have done better.
Well, that's high praise, I must say. We have here 3 questions on pitch, a subject that in the hundreds of years we've been listening to music has caused a lot of discussion. The first one, we actually started in a former quiz from Lloyd Mallet of Portland, Oregon, but we were interrupted by the chimes before we had a real chance to get going on this question, so we'll start it all over again, I think. The question is, are singers today forced to sing a half tone, full tone, or even a tone and a half higher than the singers in Mozart's day, for example? And if so, isn't this really against the composer's intentions, and doesn't the drama suffer from it? Mr. Schick?
I think in Mozart's day, there was what we call the normal pitch. What is usually overlooked is that before Mozart's day, the beginning of the 17th century, we had a much higher pitch than we have today.
Well, the pitches varied enormously along.
Yeah, of course, in the 19th century, then when the wind instruments were in a much better state of perfection, then the pitch went up because we had more brilliance from the orchestra there, where the singers start really complaining.
Yes. Well, let's get back to if we can for a moment, to the difference between Mozart's day and ours. Dr. Levery?
Well, in general, the pitch has gone up, but Mozart was not a very good example to mention. We happen to have his tuning fork. And his tuning fork is at 422, which isn't much lower than our 440. I mean, it's less than half a tone.
Yeah.
But the pitch obviously has gone up, and I think singers are straining much more than they should, for instance, in the Beethoven works.
Yes.
But the real settlement of pitch is a rather recent question. In '39, just before Star started, there was an international meeting in London which settled it. I remember with some amusement that in Italy, in a fascist country at that time, pitch was very much enforced. There were rules saying the conductor, the first fiddler, has to go to jail or pay a fine if he's playing off pitch. Now the Boston Symphony today plays at least at 4:45 or 4:46, but Mr. Lansdorf, I think, is still out of jail, for all I know.
Yes,
We
I
should
know the
keep to
Boston Symphony
4:40.
has been noted for that for some years,
Yeah.
for the brilliance that it achieved. But to get back to the Mozart, as you say quite rightly, the difference was really not quite as much as a whole half tone, was it?
It's less than a half tone.
Yes. Yeah.
No.
Dr. Ducloux wants to add something.
The main culprits in the raising of pitch was the Vienna Philharmonic, and I can relate. My teacher of orchestration was Alexander Wunderer, for many years the first oboe player of the Vienna Philharmonic, who told me a fascinating story about how this came about. Namely that, of course, the Vienna Philharmonic is a lifetime orchestra. You enter as a young man and you stay there till you are pensioned off. And now the Vienna string tone has this famous sweet quality, which Strauss refers to at the end of Rosenkavalier, Act 2, which simply consists in being slightly higher than the woodwind tone, just playing a little bit sharp. Now the young woodwind players would have trouble keeping up, so they had their instruments shortened just a little bit until they were comfortable. Now as they grew older, of course, the violinists tuned a little higher again. And so Vienna was the place where, in my student days in the late 30s, Otello was a tone higher than elsewhere. And I remember a distinguished Otello, Martin Öhman from Sweden, who had the hardest of all times getting through the role.
I mean, it was one whole tone
Oh,
higher
I
than-
can't testify to that, but it was really fearfully high. And many singers refused to sing in Vienna because of that thing. And it was there that the idea of the international conference that Dr. Levery mentioned was spawned, because it got way out of hand with
Well,
that
the-
sweet tone.
Yes, well, there were a number of these conferences. As a matter of fact, the next question that I had on pitches refers to it, so let me read it before you go on. This one was from Sheila Charas of Brooklyn, New York, who asked us, is it true that at the turn of the century there was an international conference, I believe in Paris, for the purpose of standardizing pitch? And her question was, why was such a conference necessary and what did it accomplish? Mr. Levery?
Not turn of the century. That conference was in 1858, and I happen to know the date because
You were there.
No. I happen to know the answer because a book on musical acoustics that I've written with a colleague is coming out this spring, so I've read it. Obviously, if you'll get it, you'll find all this information and many more interesting facts, etc.
Yes, well, Mr. Schick.
You know,
Mr.
talking
Schick.
of pitch, there was not only a conference, but I remember at one time, all the famous composers of the day received letters concerning the pitch at the Vienna Opera. How do you feel about it? Should it be corrected? Should it stay the way it is? And Richard Strauss replied in a wire, by all means, let's put it down because I'm tired of hearing the Meistersinger prelude in C-sharp major.
Yes. Well, Mr. Randall.
I think the whole question is really academic because, first place, singers don't sing on pitch. And no, they don't. No, that can be easily proved.
We have a few who do.
No voice
None?
stays on pitch more than a fraction of a second.
Oh,
The
I see.
vibrato alone means variation in pitch. In any case, if we could have heard the music that Mozart and Beethoven heard when they were hearing, we'd have been the orchestras didn't play in tune then, and the instruments weren't in tune, and nobody really bothered about it till these days. In fact, only a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times, Casals is quoted as saying that the first violinist who tuned accurately was Isai, and he died in 1931. So the matter of pitch really didn't matter that much.
Well, you know, I think this may have been a tradition because even Casals wasn't alive in Mozart's day, and it must have been here.
No, but the
I don't-
instruments,
I
the
don't-
instruments wouldn't play in tune. The brass and the woodwinds would not play in tune in those
Well, there were
days.
difficulties with the instruments, technical difficulties with them, but I don't think that Mozart and such musicians would have tolerated the horrible kind of thing. Dr. Ducloux.
Well, we know that Gluck, for instance, in Paris, had to get his wind players from the bande municipale, from the municipal band, and he complained that the flutes were always a half a note flat. So, I mean, he thundered and in vain for betterment.
I think that Dr. Levery
As
wants to
Dr.
add
Ducloux
something.
rightly said, wind instruments wind players can cut off the instruments to adjust, but fortunately singers can't do that to their vocal cords. I think there's some kind of a norm left, and there's a limit beyond which pitch probably can't rise. So unlike Mr. Randall, I'm very grateful for to the I feel grateful to the singers.
Well, here's still another question on this obviously controversial subject. This one comes from Elaine Olszewski, or Olszewski, I don't know which way she pronounces it, of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Mrs. Olszewski asks, since A used to be tuned considerably lower than our present-day American 440 pitch, why haven't the older operas been transposed into a lower key to make them actually sound the way the composer intended? Now, this seems a very logical question, but Dr. Levery.
Two parts, two answers to that question. First of all, I don't think her generalization is correct. Pitches were also higher. They were all over the place.
Yeah.
I know that in London, for instance, in the middle of the last century, the pitch went as high as 55, 455 for A. There was simply no need for coordination as long as you didn't have international travelers. I mean, every local outfit could just settle its own pitch question. That's one part of the answer. The other one is that transposing isn't that simple, because if you transpose a composition, let's say in C major, half a step down, you're in 7 flats, which I don't wish on any string player.
Yes, and also...
The arch
Dr.
villain, of
Ducloux.
course, is the well-tempered scale. That is the arch villain of all music. I'm thankful for it, for the wonderful music it has given us. But when it comes to singing and string playing, give me the natural pitch, natural tuning rather than well-tempered.
Oh, Dr. Ducloux has to read my book. I don't agree at all with what you're saying.
We all read.
I will.
Well, speaking of the theatrical side of opera, as we were earlier, Stan Fedison of Norfolk, Virginia, has noticed that the Metropolitan Opera has been engaging more and more stage directors whose experience has been chiefly in the legitimate theater. And his question is, what effect do you think that these directors have had on opera in our time, Mr. Schick?
Well, first of all, I think it goes hand in hand with the fact, and it's a wonderful fact, that our singers look much more like actors these days than they looked 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So I think they better act better also. And then the man who comes from Broadway, from somewhere else, has much more to say, has much more material to work with. And that's the reason I think this should be very welcome that this fact exists.
Yes, Professor Levery.
Of course, I'm not the musical consultant to the Metropolitan, but I think on the whole the effect has been wretched. I don't mean everybody. I saw at least one performance this year staged by a regular stage director, which I thought was just marvelous in every detail.
Excuse me,
But
by regular you mean
I mean
operatically trained stage director? Or
No. I meant a theater, let's say somebody who had come from the theater, and I think
see.
he did a marvelous job, but he respected the music. My objection is that too many of these stage directors that are imported, as it were, from the legitimate stage, just think music is boring and therefore have to fill out every little measure by some kind of action or horseplay. You know, you've all seen even overtures acted out in this house. Well, I think if one likes the music, one likes to leave it alone, too.
Oh, I couldn't agree more, but I've seen professional opera directors do this same thing. Mr. Randall?
Yes, what he's saying is that the theater directors who did this didn't know theater very well, and that's the case with most of them, unfortunately. And not only should they not be in the opera house, they shouldn't be in the theaters either. And I've worked with enough of them to know, and I'd be glad to name half of them. In any case, I think opera has some pretty good directors, and I'd like to see the motion reversed. I'd like to see some of the good opera directors go to the theater. We need them. I'm thinking particularly of Gunther Reinhardt. I've never seen farce, which is supposed to be something I'm pretty comfortable in. I've never seen it done as well as he does it. I'm thinking of that Rossini opera at Glyndebourne a couple of years ago, and his production of Lulu would make any theater director turn green with envy.
Oh, that's a marvelous idea. I'm glad to hear somebody speaking up for the operatically trained people. Dr. Ducloux.
I think we are at the end of a pendulum swing, which swung away from music in the direction of acting and visual things only. I think the time has come when the musician has to reassert himself in the opera house. I think that this, the world over, I think this has gone much too far, this glorification of the visual at the expense of music, and I fervently pray that opera be restored to the musician.
Oh, well, I think there are movements in that direction, as a matter of fact.
I'm all for bringing back fat ladies, for that matter, but
Do you mean that because only fat ladies can sing? I'm quite puzzled by
Fat ladies
this.
can sing, they can cook, and they can make love. It's,
That doesn't leave much for the thin ladies, does it? Here we have a question from Hewell Turkett of San Francisco, California. This introduces an interesting viewpoint about American opera. In his opinion, American opera really hasn't taken root in this country because an American style hasn't been developed. And this is what he writes us. The fact that an American composer writes an opera doesn't mean that it is an American opera. And he makes this comparison. During the 19th century, Russian composers had to break away from the Italian operatic style, which had more or less dominated opera or serious opera in Russia, and only after they did break away were they able to write first-rate operas of their own. And so his question is simply this: does the panel think it is important that we in this country develop an American style of opera, just as we have Russian, French, German, and Italian operatic styles? Meister Schick.
I think it is very important because opera will only then get popular if the country itself comes up to it.
If it produces
If
operas
it produces
that are
its own American brand of opera, I think. Otherwise it will remain some kind of a foreign article, which unfortunately it, in some instances still is.
Yes, that's certainly true. Dr. Ducloux.
I think it is crucial for the survival and development of opera in America. I think the subject matter is of very great importance. Now, for instance, I consider The Saint of Bleecker Street a thoroughly American story. It's the story of the immigrant versus the new America and so forth. Unfortunately, it seems to me that too many American opera composers go too far afield and take some fancy subject, which, however, has little to tell our day. I have such an opera on my desk right now, which is musically very strong, even dramatically strong, but for California, for instance, way out in left field.
Well, there's another aspect of this question I would like to throw to you, and that is great opera necessarily national in its color? I mean, after all, Mozart was not so specifically Austrian when he wrote The Marriage of Figaro, and Gluck was not very specifically French when he wrote his operas. And there was a time when nationalism was considered a rather provincial point of view in... I think Dr. Ducloux wanted to give a quick answer despite those chimes, did you?
I would think that any composer should not only be national, but preferably even local.
Uh-huh. Well, that's
but be great at the same
a
time.
fruitful point of view. But I'm afraid those chimes which Ron Bagnier was just playing for us... Oh, by the way, did you recognize them, gentlemen? Were you listening? Dr. Levery?
We will recognize it in the next act, I think, won't we? Isn't it the fanfare out of
Yes,
third act Otello?
Scene of the Venetian ambassadors, yes.
I like to add, it's a little bit easier to play them on the chimes and on the trumpets.
Ah. Well, I'm afraid that they do bring me to stop for today because the third act is almost ready to begin. So thank you very much, Walter Ducloux, Sigmund Leverie, Tony Randall, and George Schick. This is Edward Downes inviting you to be with us again next week during the second intermission of Puccini's Madama Butterfly for another session of Texaco's Opera Quiz.